about socialist policies becoming more popular. I think, if you like, populism is becoming more popular. So anybody with simple answers to the problems, whether that's the sort of reform approach, the populist approach there, or the sort of hard left green approach.
One person we should talk about is Rachel Reeves, who of course was clearly feeling the pressure.
These big economic spending reforms that Labour have been trying to do might actually be quite difficult to do in the future as a result of that rebellion that we saw last week, which essentially rendered any cost savings from the welfare reforms that were attempted last week to be essentially useless.
From CapEx, this is The Capitalist. I'm Marc Sidwell. My guests today are the independent economist Julian Jessop and the broadcaster and financial analyst Albie Amankona. Labour's had just a year in office and already the sheen is wearing off. After campaigning to stop the chaos, Sir Keir Starmer now finds himself navigating plenty of it. A striking 72% of the public believe his government is at least as chaotic as the last, and over a third say it's worse, according to a poll by More in Common. With welfare reform plans in disarray and the Prime Minister's authority visibly faltering, the question is clear. Can Labour regain control, or is this just the beginning of the storm? Now, Julian, if I start with you, Keir Starmer, of course, does have an enormous majority. He has a number of years still to run before he has to go to the public again. Are we exaggerating how bad things are for him at the moment, or is he really in trouble?
Well, politically, he's probably okay, as you say. He still has 4 years before the election, and it's actually quite hard for the Labour Party, at least, to remove a sitting Prime Minister. So I think politically he will survive, but the problem is the economy and the impact on the rest of us in the meantime. I guess there are a number of factors that have contributed to this. So one is that I think the Labour Party fought the election on a fairly dishonest manifesto, effectively promising big increases in spending without any real sense of where that's going to come from, and tying their hands on the main tax increases that otherwise they might have considered doing. I was also surprised and actually disappointed that, despite being in opposition for 14 years, they haven't seemed to have found the time to come up with a credible alternative plan, or even the people for some of the key roles. So it's pretty clear that Keir Starmer himself regrets his appointment of Sue Owen to a senior post advising him. There are doubts about some of the senior civil servants as well. So the head of the civil service, Chris Wormold, there seems to be some sense of buyer's regret about appointing him too. So they didn't really have a proper plan. They didn't really seem to have the proper people to push it through. And that's part of the reason, I think, why we've seen this sort of series of U-turns. Reflecting also possibly, of course, a lack of experience and political nous. These are the flip side of having been out of power for 14 years, of course, is that you don't realise how difficult government can sometimes be. And that reality has hit home very hard over the last year.
Yes, and you're talking there, Julian, about senior appointments. And I suppose one person we should talk about is Rachel Reeves, who, of course, was clearly feeling the pressure last week. Do you think that her fortunes are tied too closely to Keir Starmer for him to contemplate getting rid of her? Of course, the markets have also suggested that they worry about who might replace her, so perhaps in that sense she's secure. But no one seems very happy with the job she's done so far. Do you think Starmer can keep her in place?
Oh, I think she'll almost certainly stay in post. And in a sense, of course, there have been a number of opportunities or reasons to get rid of her already, not just her clear discomfort at PMQs, whatever the reason for that might have been. But, previously the doubts about her CV, for example, the way that she seems to have said a number of things that simply economically are not true. So claiming that an increase in employers' national insurance is not going to have any impact on working people, whereas, of course, we've seen the impact come through very clearly in a large number of job losses. So there are a number of opportunities already to get rid of her, and I think, therefore, she will remain in post. But what you said about the market, I think, is also very important. It was striking that the markets took the watering down of the welfare bill pretty much in their strides. There's no adverse reaction to that. But they did not like the sight of the Chancellor crying effectively at parliamentary questions. And it is precisely for the reason that you say. It's not that they think she's doing a stellar job. In many cases, of course, quite the opposite. It's just that they fear what might come if she left. I think if she did leave, one of the things that would probably go are the fiscal rules. Now, I'm not a huge fan of fiscal rules in general, but the ones that we now have are probably about as sensible and as credible as we're going to get. So I think there would be valid concerns if Rachel Reeves were to go, the fiscal rules would follow. That would push up government borrowing costs and make the whole economic and fiscal crisis even worse than it currently is. So for those reasons, I think she will stay, but she's clearly damaged, and it's very hard to see her increasing credibility in government policy making any further, rather than keeping it weak.
Albie, I suppose the big story here, as well as what's going on with Reeves, has been the power of Labour's backbench MPs to rebel and to force change. Do you think now that they smell blood effectively, they've managed to force a number of U-turns, or why would they stop now? They're going to continue causing trouble for Starmer?
Without question, I think they will probably continue to cause trouble for Starmer and Rachel Reeves, whether it's over things like the two-child benefit cap, which a lot of backbenchers want to see ended. Indeed, we actually heard reports that the Prime Minister himself wanted to see the two-child benefit cap lifted. Today, we've heard some reports about potential changes to classifying children as to whether or not they are suitable for sort of special needs education. SEND is probably the correct political acronym. That's caused a bit of upset on the Labour backbenches. So these big economic spending reforms that Labour have been trying to do might actually be quite difficult to do in the future as a result of that rebellion that we saw last week, which essentially rendered any cost savings from the welfare reforms that were attempted last week to be essentially useless. It might actually end up costing the government more. I think what's regrettable about the situation with Rachel Reeves, although I agree with Julian, she has done a pretty terrible job in a lot of respects, and especially when it comes to the national insurance contributions rise, the workers' rights bill, which is going to be forthcoming. A lot of the instincts that she had were actually correct, whether or not that was looking at things like deregulating the planning system to make it easier to build infrastructure and housing, whether or not it was looking at means testing benefits going to the wealthiest cohort in society through the winter fuel allowance. I thought that was a good policy. I don't know why the Tories opposed it. Or indeed whether or not it was these welfare reforms that the Labour Party tried to get through, but obviously failed for the reasons that I highlighted previously. Actually, a lot of the instincts that Rachel Reeves has had have been correct. I think maybe the argument on the right might be, or at least the economic rights, or the sort of economically liberal idea, libertarianism, you might think, well, they don't really go far enough. We should be looking at the triple lock on pensions as well as the winter fuel allowance. If we're going to means test one of them, why not means test all benefits that go to pensioners? When it comes to planning reform, let's go a lot further. Look at some of the things that Robert Jenrick was trying to do when he was the housing secretary under Boris Johnson, which obviously didn't happen for political reasons. So a lot of the instincts, actually, for me, as someone who is more of a free marketeer, some of the instincts I have actually applauded, but it's just a shame that the Labour backbenchers haven't let her go through with it. And also, the Conservatives and the Reform Party, who were supposed to be representing at least right-wing economic ideas, have stopped her from going through with any of those reforms either, especially with the winter fuel allowance. We've even got the Reform Party supporting lifting the two-child benefit cap, whilst wanting to bring in sweeping tax cuts, like lifting the personal allowance to £20,000. The economic consensus of the right is no better than the left's at the moment, in my view.
Julian, did you want to say something about that?
Well, I just to agree, but also to express sort of sense of frustration that we seem to have a sort of artificial debate about lots of these things at the moment, with no clear dividing lines between the main political parties. So now I would love it if going into the next election we did have those clear dividing lines. So from the point of view of Labour, for example, I wish they would stand explicitly on a programme of a bigger state with more spending financed by higher taxes. Equally, I would like the Conservatives to stand more explicitly on a programme of a smaller, more efficient state. with reduced spending and lower taxes to give people a more honest choice. And other parties, I think, might have a role to play there as well. So Reform seems to have cornered the market in what we might call naked populism. So they're going to come up with any policy that scores well in the opinion polls or with donors. And that's fair enough as an alternative. We might have the Lib Dems running on a nakedly pro-EU platform as a single issue party to rejoin the EU. And the Greens or some sort of green left coalition of, hard left parties, anti-Western parties, anti-growth parties, which I suspect will probably, unfortunately, get about 10% of the vote. So I would love to see the next election fall on more honest terms with clearer distinctions between the parties. Because in many ways, of course, what the current Labour government is doing is continuing with more of the same under the previous Conservative governments that really, frankly, weren't that free market at all.
Yes, and the great disappointment with Labour, I suppose, is there was a hope that this was a new coalition with perhaps slightly less dependent on pensioners, and it might be able to force through some of the things that the Conservative coalition found so difficult. But you were talking there about clearer dividing lines at the next election, and that brings us on to our next topic. Because last week, the MP Zara Sultana resigned from the Labour Party and announced the formation with former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn of a new radical left-wing party, vowing that the next election would be a choice between socialism and barbarism. Is this a sign that socialist ideas are becoming mainstream once more? And what does it mean for the reshaping of British politics? Now, Albie, this was a fairly chaotic launch or announcement of this new plan. Jeremy Corbyn seemed to sort of back away from it a little bit, and possibly Zara jumped the gun somewhat. But it does seem like this is a serious plan, and they're going to try and bring together some of these independent MPs who are very concerned about Gaza, for example, into a new socialist hard left coalition. What do you think that's likely to mean? Is that going to be a serious prospect of the election? Are they going to get a serious part of the vote?
My instinct is saying no, it won't, because a lot of the independent MPs who are in Parliament at the moment got elected off the back of what's going on in the Middle East, notably between Israel and Gaza, and also in the West Bank. That was really the focal point for a lot of the people who voted for the five pro-Gaza independents, as they're called, and indeed Jeremy Corbyn. And that was obviously the focal point of Zara Sultana's resignation from the Labour Party as well. I think we should all hope and pray that in 4 years' time, that situation is at least somewhat resolved or fully resolved, and at least improved by a large proportion. So perhaps it won't be such a touch point in 4 years' time as it was last summer. That being said, I don't necessarily have a problem with people on the left deciding to form their own political party if they do not feel their political views and ideals are being represented by the present Labour Party. If it splits the vote between left-wing voters, just as the Reform Party's vote and Labour and the Conservative Party's vote are split between each other, and that is how Labour snuck in a lot of seats, then that won't be a bad thing for the right. On the broader point about whether or not socialism is becoming more popular as an idea, Jeremy Corbyn, he didn't win the 2017 election, but he did very well, a lot better than we thought he was going to do, with his agenda, his social democratic agenda that was a lot more left-wing than things that we've seen in recent time. So I think these ideas are popular with a portion of the population. I think they always have been. I think they always will be. It doesn't mean I think that they're right, but I don't know that Zara Sultana leaving the Labour Party in order to form some sort of grand left-wing coalition, potentially with the Greens, including Zach Polansky, if he becomes the co-leader, is a demonstration that these ideas are any more popular now than they were 10 years ago when Jeremy Corbyn was elected the Labour leader.
Yeah, well, Albie, if I could just follow up on the sort of the electoral effects, as you were saying there. Well, maybe that's not so bad for the right if this splits the vote. Suddenly, it seems that some people in Reform have been celebrating at this news. They feel that this is going to peel off a little more of Labour's vote, which is already fairly shallow in a lot of places. Reform already making quite strong gains according to the polling. Do you think this is something that could allow Reform even more chance of actually forming a government or leading a coalition government after the next election? And as Julian was saying, of course, Reform's economics, at least, certainly quite left-wing these days. There's certainly not a sort of clearly right-wing or Thatcherite programme. So what that means for right-wing economics is a sort of alarming prospect, perhaps.
I mean, Reform's economic policy are not right-wing whatsoever. They're all over the place. On the one hand, they want to spend lots of money. On the other hand, they want to cut lots of taxes. It just doesn't work. You can't do things like that. So I don't think you could describe Reform's politics as left-wing or right-wing. I would just call them batty. But on the point about whether or not this left-wing coalition party could be a beneficiary for reform, well, it all really depends on which parts of the country that left-wing party are going to be targeting. We know that where reform seem to be performing quite well, although they're performing well everywhere, they're performing particularly well in a lot of the red wall seats that voted for the Conservatives for the first time in 2019 under Boris Johnson. Now, I don't think the Tories will win those seats back. The question is if this left-wing coalition party, is it popular in these parts of the country, these red wall seats where it's kind of a reform Labour fight, if you will? And if they are popular in those seats of the country, with high Muslim populations, for example, thinking of the outskirts of Greater Manchester and West Yorkshire, it could absolutely be advantageous for the Reform Party. But unfortunately, I don't see it being as advantageous for the Conservative Party.
Julian, on this wider point about the rise of socialist ideas, or these sort of more radical left-wing ideas, which in some ways seem to be in abeyance for a while. I mean, what's your take? I mean, we see, for example, a lot of evidence that the younger generations, or admittedly they're not voting so much now, but presumably they will in time, that they're much more open to socialistic ideas. We've seen even the Labour Party grandee like Neil Kinnock coming forward this weekend and saying that they'd be open to wealth tax as a way of plugging the holes in the national accounts. Do you think we should be concerned about the rise of these more radical ideas, and how can we push back against them?
Well, I think we should be concerned. What I find particularly frustrating is that these ideas, in a sense, are nothing new. And in many cases, every time they've been tried previously in any other country, they have failed. And the wealth tax is a prime example of that. No country has ever succeeded in raising anywhere near as much money as the supporters of a wealth tax in the UK are proposing we could get here. Another example would be things like, rent controls, which we know backfire. They always end up harming the very people that they're supposed to help. But nonetheless, they are popular. We're seeing that, as you said, in the race for the New York mayor. I mean, the guy who's the front runner there is proposing policies that we simply know from past experience don't work. Nonetheless, they keep coming back again and again and again, which I do find worrying. We just have to keep, banging the drum and pointing to all the evidence. I mean, interestingly, of course, one big development over the last year or so is, what's happening in Argentina, the way that Argentina has been turned around by free market policies, precisely the policies that many of us would advocate. So it does seem ironic that socialist ideas seem to be on the rise, when perhaps the most dramatic example of a turnaround we've seen recently is because of policies being adopted that are almost exactly the opposite of the socialist agenda. You mentioned, by the way, also young people not voting. There's an interesting angle here about the potential impact of lowering the voting age from 18 to 16. There's been quite limited polling on this so far, but what it does suggest is that there's quite a split amongst 16 and 17-year-olds between boys and girls. So girls seem to be a bit more attracted to what you might call the orthodox left-wing or green parties. But boys of 16 and 17-year-olds seem to be overwhelmingly attracted to the reform agenda. And I think this is consistent with a more general point to talk about, socialist policies becoming more popular. I think, if you like, populism is becoming more popular. So anybody with simple answers to the problems, whether that's the sort of reform approach, the populist approach there, or the sort of hard left green approach, simple solutions are proving popular. I personally think that's always a dangerous approach, because the real world is not simple. It's far more complicated than that. There are always big economic and social trade-offs to take account of. The public finances are too perilous to take big risks in any direction. So it's more the sort of rise of simplistic populism that worries me, rather than socialism as such or on its own.
Interesting. And yes, maybe this suggests that with what you were saying before about Argentina, that what we need to hope for is a kind of charismatic politician of the sort of Milei variety who can communicate in a modern way, but about some of the difficulties of economic realities and how to work with that. Well, let's move on to our final topic today. Finally, some optimism. A bold plan promises state-of-the-art IT for the NHS, with £200 million earmarked to speed up and streamline patient care. But before you get too excited, there is a catch. The promise was actually included in a report published 25 years ago. As Christian Niemitz noted in CapEx last week, Labour's new NHS report, its 10-year health plan for England, titled Fit for the Future, talks a good game, but offers little that hasn't been said before. But there are a lot of industries on the brink of a transformative AI revolution. Tech really does seem to be in a more exciting place. So will the reforms make a difference this time around? Albie, are you hopeful that Wes Streeting can grip the NHS and use new technologies to improve its productivity?
I think Wes Streeting is one of the more competent Labour ministers, noting he's actually got a very slim majority because of the Gaza independence we were talking about earlier on. I think it's just a couple of hundred now for that reason entirely. But in terms of this whole, we're going to use digital and technology to improve NHS outcomes, as you say, it's nothing new. And when we talk about AI, yes, it does have a lot of transformative power. But I mean, in my day job, I cover a lot of technology, media and telecoms companies. And you're right, there are a lot of innovations that are coming with AI. But actually, a lot of stuff that we're calling AI now isn't necessarily, they're not necessarily completely new lines of technology at all. And they're actually things that we've been using for quite some time. So I suppose my question is, if the NHS was not able to use technological innovations that we've seen already over the past 10 to 15 years, whether or not that's high-speed internet, things like 5G, things like telemedicine, like other things like the medical advances that we've seen, if the NHS hasn't been able to use that to become more efficient or cut costs in a dramatic way, why do you think that's going to happen in the future? And actually, there's not necessarily much evidence from what I understand that even moving from this sort of more moving towards a more preventative style of healthcare, preventing people from getting sick in the first place, necessarily leads to lower healthcare costs in the long term. Because if you're prolonging how long people live, they're going to get some sort of health condition that requires some sort of help later on in life. So as a direct result of us all living longer, healthcare costs are going up. So we think, yes, of course, we all want to live for as long as we possibly can. That's got to be a good thing. But ultimately, that does just lead to spiralling healthcare costs. And I think we've got to have an honest conversation about the NHS. And until I think there is a political party which is brave enough, and not even Reform seems to be brave enough to talk about the NHS funding model, I think we're going to continue to have these discussions about 10 or 20-year plans, and actually they won't lead to that much change in the long term. There'll be more and more winter crises like we've seen through every year of my lifetime, and things won't really improve. We need to be looking at the healthcare systems around the world that really work, at places like Australia, places like other European countries, and I think we've got to move away from the sacred cow that is the NHS and its funding model being entirely dependent on taxation. And yes, maybe we need to think about whether or not it needs to be free at the point of use for everyone in every circumstance.
Julian, Albie mentions reform there, and I think Nigel Farage has actually made noises about the sort of French health insurance model as something the NHS should look at, although I don't think it's made it to reform policy yet, and one suspects that it might not go down too well with some of their voters. But what's your take? I mean, Labour is pouring in whatever it is, 29 billion extra into the NHS, making all these grand promises for how they want to reform things. Do you think it can move the dial, or are you with Albie that we just need to think much bigger about reform?
Yes, I think you need a much more fundamental rethink of the NHS. So I think there are problems that apply actually to a lot of public services that explain the poor productivity performance. And I'd essentially identify three problems. One is, of course, the lack of competition and market mechanisms in the NHS. It's a monolithic provider. So you don't get the same sort of choice and frankly, the profit motive that drives innovation in other sectors. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is partly related to that, which is very, very strong trade unions. And I'm particularly thinking of the BMA as one of the most obstructive trade unions out there. So they're reporting campaigns against, physician associates in particular, the idea that only a certain type of doctor should be allowed to provide a certain type of care, I think is really old fashioned and backward. And then the third issue is the general issue around the funding model. There are lots of problems here. I mean, one is that NHS finance is overly dependent on the government of the day, the appetite of the Treasury for pumping money in or not, as the case may be. And also on the other side of the equation, I know it's incredibly controversial to say this, to question whether the NHS should be free at the point of use. It's worth stressing, though, that principle has already been bent. Lots of people, for example, do pay for NHS prescriptions. But now I've turned 60, magically I don't have to pay for NHS prescriptions anymore. Now, I'm, pretty good health and, financially I have no problem paying prescriptions, but I'm now getting them for free, which doesn't seem to make an awful lot of sense for me. So I think there are aspects of even the current model that might need tweaking. But until you tackled all of those issues, the lack of competition, the excessively strong trade unions and question marks over the funding model, I think the NHS is always going to be behind the curve compared to other healthcare systems, whether it's elsewhere in Europe or in Asia. The difficulty we have here is that anytime anybody starts talking about this, people immediately say it's a choice between the NHS and the US healthcare system. I have yet to meet anybody or any area of this debate who thinks the the US system would be a good one to copy. But we're always going to get that thrown back in our faces, which is really frustrating.
Yes, well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there and continue to hope for some politicians who can see their way through all these long-standing problems that need a bit of courage and are hard to make popular with the public. Albie, Amankona and Julian Jessop, thank you both. Make sure you're subscribed to our daily email briefings. Go to capex.co, that's capx.co. I'm Marc Sidwell. Goodbye.